So I'm going to be doing a quick run through of what we mean by monitoring and observability and some of the sort of big why questions. And as the title says, this is an introduction. It's meant to get you a grounding in the topic. It's not meant to sort of be a deep dive. It'll equip you to do a deep dive yourself and explore the various tools available in the cloud native landscape and sort of explore what works for you in terms of monitoring and observability. So let's have a quick look at what we'll cover. Like I said, we're not going to be doing specific tools in this presentation. This is more of a philosophical overview. And we'll look at the question of why you would want to monitor your apps, how you get from that data that you get from monitoring them to information, and how you get from that information into actionable insights, and then a little bit about the concept of observability and how that sort of fits in with monitoring and how they interrelate. So what do we mean when we say monitor, right? What are we monitoring? And because we at Civo are a sort of cloud native Kubernetes cloud provider, I'll take the example of Kubernetes, where apps are deployed to a cluster in containers, which are grouped into pods and then run on nodes, right? And each of those components, the nodes themselves, the cluster at the top, the nodes, the pods, and the individual containers, each of those produces records. And those records are things like what is happening at any given time, who's accessing what, are they able to hear other things that they're meant to be hearing, any errors that occur if they're not, etc. Right? And this happens on every level of the infrastructure. So a node will have its own system log, and the pods will have pod logs, and each container will record its own logs while the container is around. And you can feed all of that into sort of various types of logging backends and tools and things like that if you want them to be kept around for longer than the cluster keeps it around. But basically, there's a huge amount of stuff. So why are we monitoring, right? So our applications and infrastructure provide us with huge amounts of data straight out the box about their performance. And this is even before you start to configure your own things, right? And so, like I said, we can see error rates and how long requests to an API can take, or trends in demand that help with business planning. So you can control your costs if you see that you don't actually need a certain amount of infrastructure deployed at a given time because your demand just isn't there. So it all comes down to answering the question of, do you know your app is working the way that you want it to? Right? So how do we get to that? How to get to answering that question, right? So we get this firehose of data from our applications, right? They're constantly spitting out data in form of logs about their state and what's happening and what's changing. And in order to gain control over this amount of data, we have to process it to be useful information, right? So to go from data to information, raw facts. So the logs themselves are data, but they're not information. Information is data that is being put into context, and context gives meaning, right? So you can have a stream of data that doesn't mean anything on its own, but when you sort of process it and when you know what it truly means, then you can have information about what's happening. Combining the streams of data can give sort of information and useful insights beyond each individual thing. But the crucial thing is, you can't monitor absolutely everything. Not everything has meaning to answer the question of, is my app performing the way that I expect it to, right? And this is monitoring design. So ultimately, you are being given far more data than is probably useful for you, but some of it might be useful at certain times and some of it might not be. So it's up to you as the sort of monitoring designer, so to speak, to coin a phrase, to make use of the data where it's appropriate, right? And that information, when you process it correctly, can give you insights to where your application could be performing better with more efficiency or with fewer errors, right? So now we're at the insights. how do we get to, sorry, where information, how do we get to insight and action, right? So your insights for action. So how do we know that something is happening and why it's happening? It can only be as good as the data you gather and how you organize it. And the key thing is more is not always better. So you have to be monitoring with intent. So keep in mind that question that I asked at the start is like, is my application performing the way that it's supposed to be, right? Monitoring with intent means thinking about your targets. What do you want to achieve? Like what is it that you know, what do you want a piece of information that you get to tell you about where you want to be? So, for example, uptime, right? How many nines of uptime do you want? You hear this thing of like 9.995 nines of uptime, which is like you're only down for 28 hours a day or something, 28 hours a year. So how many nines of uptime do you want? Which data points will help you achieve that? And how will you know that you don't reach that? So do you have monitoring set up for systems going down? And if they do go down, do you have monitoring that will help you get into the insight of finding the cause of the problem that brought the system down, right? And if your system doesn't get information about what broke and why and when, it's not worth much. So you can know that it's not working because you can't access your website, but you have to know why it's not working, right? So that's monitoring in a nutshell, in a very, very tight nutshell. Let's talk about observability and how that fits in. Well, observability has a lot to do with that insights thing that I mentioned just now. So forgive me, the next slide is going to get a little bit meta, right? Observability, which you often see as O11Y, the same way as Kubernetes is K8S, because observability is a long word. And so you just see it as O with 11 letters and then Y. But basically, observability has its origin in mathematics and control theory and this mathematician called Kalman in 1960. And for him, observability was defined as inferring the internal state of a system from external outputs. Okay, so that sounds a little bit esoteric, but let's take a human example. So if all you knew that somebody had a high heart rate, so the external output is that their pulse is very high, what does that tell you about their internal state, right? They could be scared, so their heart rate is up, or they could have run 10 kilometers just now, or any number of other reasons why their heart rate is spiking, right? You need to know enough about the system's outputs to be able to build a picture of what's happening on the inside. That's what's observability, right? So in software, it's, then I got this definition from the really good O'Reilly book, Observability Engineering by Charity Majors, Liz Fong-Jones, and George Miranda. It's inferring the current and possible states of a software system, even complex ones, from the monitoring insights. That's observability. So it's by going, because things look like this, that means this has happened, right? So even if things are working well, you kind of know they are working well because our monitoring says so. Or if something goes wrong, you will know what failed and where, and crucially, why. So basically, you can understand the possible states that your system can be in based on what you get given. So this, again, goes back to your monitoring design thing. Are you measuring the right things, and are you monitoring the right things for you to be able to sort of keep tabs on what's happening and why? All right. I did say it was going to get meta. So here's a really good quote that I saw from Helen Beale, who's at the DevOps Institute, that observability is not monitoring. We monitor when we observe our observable systems through tools, right? So observability is a quality of well-designed software systems. There are tools that help you build the monitoring and achieve observability, but you need to keep it in mind what it is that you're looking to achieve with your monitoring. So you go back to that original question of like the why, right? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? Why do I have 2 megabytes of logs every second if you don't know what they're saying and what they actually mean, right? You don't want to drink from the fire hose. You want to be able to know exactly what's happening, why, and when, right? So with that crash course in observability and how it's a quality rather than a thing that you do. So you don't do observability, you have it or you don't have it. Let's do a really quick summary, right? Monitoring and observability are interrelated things, but they are separate. Modern software, especially sort of cloud-based, containerized, microservice software, is ridiculously complex and produces masses of data in the form of logs straight out the box, even before you configure your own custom stuff. It's on us as software writers, designers, to try and turn this flood of data into actionable insights that you can monitor with the intention of achieving what your business targets are. So if you think about DevOps and everything feeding into the next stage, right, and it being a process, you need to have a sort of key result that you're looking for in what you want your product to achieve, and your monitoring and your sort of observability need to feed toward that result. Sometimes less is more, right? So monitoring with intent and not getting lost in the weeds of every possible trace and event is important, especially in the case of you debugging something that's just brought the whole thing down, right? If you have too much stuff, it can be hard to find out what's actually happening when it happens. Obviously, we would like there to not be a situation where something happens, but stuff will happen, right? So the idea is to sort of build software with the observability in mind as you're building it, to try and build systems that you know the internal state of your application's sort of components based on what they give out at any given point. So you know that if microservice A fails and therefore can't communicate with microservice B, and B goes, I haven't heard from A, then you kind of know, okay, that's what this means. And that means that we need to recover microservice A, right? So the sort of having insight into the internal state based on what you get given is the basis of observability and true understanding of your systems. And I realized that I just ran 15 minutes of like systems theory and sort of strange Hungarian mathematicians, but hopefully that has sort of at least given you some idea of what it is that we talk about when we talk about monitoring.
Hey everyone, thanks for passing it over. I thought definitely really helpful talk. Specifically, I think you nailed some things that people kind of miss when they're first thinking about, designing their systems. Is like, we have all of this data, but like, what are we going to do with it? Because, and I've been guilty of this in the past. Setting alerts on things, and then it ends up not even mattering because it's kind of white noise because they fire all the time. So I
And
think
then you
you really
might miss the thing that actually matters because you're like, oh yeah, whatever, like just silence the notification, right?
exactly. Everyone's had that one Slack channel where there's a ton of alerts in it, but it's not really affecting the system. So you just learn to ignore it. And that's not really, what you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to achieve is, these actionable alerts so that when you get them, something's actually wrong. And they give you the kind of resources to quickly debug and get a fix out if you need to.
Yeah. So you want to know kind of what's happened, where it's happened, ideally why it's happened, and then therefore infer out of that kind of what you can do,
Exactly. And the more information you can give yourself, like with the alert itself, it's going to make those like secondary steps even easier. So you know what to do, right? If the alert's kind of like set up correctly.
Yeah, exactly. That is not just like an alarm that goes off. Like, say you have, to take a factory example, and like suddenly the siren goes off, and you're like, is that a fire alarm, or is it, like you kind of know, okay, something's important. But yeah, because we have software and the software can tell us stuff, we can have that feed into the alert and going like, cannot ping this, or latency level exceeded, or processor spike, so we need more capacity, or whatever, right?
Exactly. I think it's nice to start at like a high level, like what you're trying to achieve. And maybe that's, we want the latency or the P95 latency for all of our requests to be lower than this, because when they're higher, users start to complain and they're, frustrated with our website because it's loading so slow, and, help tickets jump. So kind of this, defining what exactly those thresholds you need to meet are, I think is super important. And that's probably dependent on your business. So it's something you should work out with the rest of your team.
Yeah.
And then, putting the kind of the tools in place to be able to accurately track those over time and make sure you meet them.
Yeah, I think that's also really what you said, like discussing with your team, right? So if you are on, software engineering team one, you might not really even mind that a page loads slowly. But when the customer service team is getting tickets about like, this is so slow, I can't keep using you, you know, you we're all on the same team here, right? We're all on trying to get the so an alert that you might not care about sort of personally might actually be really important to somebody else.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that you might be willing to put up with as like a non-user of the product, maybe only loading one page, but for someone who's got you open in 12 tabs and they're refreshing between all of them, it could drive them crazy. So yeah, making sure that communication between teams is strong is super important as well.
Yeah.